Hi, welcome to Screencastify for slides 8 through 15 of your culminating activity on density for the hot air balloon launch. So you're going to go ahead and watch this Screencastify to help you with answering the questions from slides 8 through 15. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, slide 18 talks about density. So density is a measure of the amount of objects in a certain space. Density can tell people how crowded an area is. We can use density when we talk about the number of people in an area. We call it population density. And that measures the number of people that live in an area. We can say that we have a density in our classroom of so many students. Okay, maybe our density is more or less than, say, the density in maybe Miss Easley's class. Okay. So places with more people living in a space have a higher density, and if less people have less density. Now, density can also describe an object, and that's what our lesson is going to be on, and that's what we're going to talk about, is we're going to talk about the density of objects. So it can tell you how much material an object contains compared to the amount of space it takes up. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in our lessons, is the density of an object. All right, so let's look at our questions. All right, so here's our word bank: space, material, measure, and object. Hint: one word is used 2 times. So in this case, we have one of those words that you're going to be using twice. And remember, you're going to be putting your answers right here. So density is the blank of the amount of blank in a certain blank. Okay, might be pretty easy to figure out. Density can tell how much blank an object contains compared to the amount of blank the object takes up. So you can figure out which word is going to be used twice. Well, I bet you can do that. So good luck with answering these questions. Remember, you can always go back and reread it, as well as listen to me read it to you again. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, the next slide is going to be weight. Let's talk about weight. We don't like talking about weight, like getting on scales and stuff. That's kind of scary. We don't like that. A person can have 2 objects that are around the same size, like 2 people, but have different densities. Okay, so you might have 2 things that kind of have the same size, but have different densities. The object with more density is going to weigh more. For example, a brick and a sponge. Okay, they are about the same size, okay, but a sponge has less density, so it's going to weigh a lot less. Brick's going to have really high density, so it's going to weigh more. Okay. All right, let's take a look at our questions. Look at that. There's a brick and a sponge, a picture right there. And here are is our word bank right here. Let's take a look at this example. So example, a brick and a sponge are around the same size, but have different densities. A brick is heavier than a sponge. So let's take a look at our questions, and remember, put your answers right here. 2 objects around the same size can have different blanks. The object that weighs blank has a blank density. The object that weighs blank has a blank density. For example, and put your answers right here. All right, let's go to the next slide. Remember, you can always pause the slides. You can always pause the Screencastify, rewind it, go back. Okay, so this is at your pace. All right, water. Well, an object's density determines whether it will sink or float. Okay, so we're going to do some experiments of sinking and floating things. All right, so an object will sink if its density is higher than the water's density. Remember how we talked about how solid things have a lot of molecules in a really small space and it's really tight together, and how liquids have not quite as many molecules and it's kind of spaced out just a little bit more? Well, that's why, okay, because of density. So an object will float if the density is lower than the water density. Water behaves differently than any other materials. Most objects become more dense when they change from a liquid to a gas. But water is a little bit different. Water acts kind of strangely. When water freezes into ice, becomes a solid, well, the molecules actually move further apart. It's a weird thing about water. Water doesn't behave like any other material. So actually, ice is less dense than water, and therefore ice floats. This only happens with water. Pretty cool, right? All right, let's look at our questions. So again, we have our word bank: float, different, freezes, less, and more. And none of the words are going to be used more than once. So you're going to be using all the words one time. An object will sink if its density is blank than water. An object will float if its density is blank than water. Remember, water is blank than other materials. Water becomes less dense when it blanks. Ice blanks on water. Okay, I think you guys can do this. All right, let's do number 14. So now we talked about water. Now let's talk about air. Okay, we can't even see air, but it does have molecules. Okay, remember molecules are really, really super tiny. Objects will rise in air if their density is lower. So think about like a balloon. Okay, we talked about balloons. Remember, we looked at some balloons before. The air, if their density is lower than the density of air. For example, balloons filled with a gas called helium, and I'm sure you've seen helium tanks. You've been to those party stores and they blow up the balloons in those tanks, and all of a sudden the balloon floats. Okay, well, that's because helium, its density is lower than the air's density. Now, if you fill a balloon with human breath, so balloons filled with human breath, well, they'll sink because our breath, is higher than the air density because we have a lot more stuff in our breath than just helium. We've got all these other types of gases, and plus we have like water molecules and viruses and germs and all those crazy things, okay, that come out of our mouths. So that makes our breath denser than the air around it because there's actually more stuff in it. A hot air balloon works because of density. A burner heats air and lowers its density. The hot air rises, causing the balloon to lift into the air. It will come back down when the air cools or some hot air is let out of it. All right, let's take a look at our questions. We got 11 questions here, okay? But take a look at our note. It says here some words are used more than once. Here's our word bank: rise, heat, lower, cooler, helium, sink, and higher. Why do balloons float? Okay, we're going to use our air paragraph to help us answer those questions. Okay, so you can use the air paragraph. Objects will blank if their density is blank, then the density of air. Balloons are filled with blank because its density is blank than air. If you blow up a balloon, it will blank because your breath density is blank than the air's. Hot air balloons use a burner to blank air to blank its density. Okay. Hot air will blank, so the balloon will blank. It will come back down when the air is. All right. Okay, so there is your screencastify for slides 8 through 15. All right, remember, you can always go back, rewind, watch it again, and answer your questions. All right, we'll see you again. Bye-bye.